How could a makeshift contraption, originally camouflaged under the derisory designation of an agricultural tractor, become the most produced tank of the Third Reich, even as its design was technically obsolete before the very first cannon shot? This narrative pulls back the curtain on the obscure trajectory of a machine that propaganda hailed as an invincible predator, but which in reality proved to be a literal steel coffin for its own crews. Discover why German engineers, cornered by the failure of their armour plating, resorted to desperately slathering concrete over their hulls, and how this allegedly heavy tank ended up sinking in shame into the mud of the Eastern Front under the crushing weight of its own contradictions. We shall explore the monumental historical absurdity that saw these vestiges of the Wehrmacht return to active service 20 years after the fall of Berlin, fighting side by side with their former arch-enemies, the Soviet T-34s, in the scorching sands of the Near East. Forget the myth of Germanic technological superiority. Here is the raw and unvarnished chronicle of a metallic nightmare that refused to die, an odyssey far more grotesque than any fiction. The Panzerkampfwagen IV medium tank, logged in military registries under the technical nomenclature Sonderkraftfahrzeug 161, embodies a glaring paradox in the history of German armament. This behemoth, initially conceived as a mere secondary support vehicle, mutated through a sheer lack of alternatives into the indispensable backbone of the armoured forces. The genesis of this steel colossus is inextricably linked to an era of deception and major technological wanderings. Since the Treaty of Versailles strictly forbade Germany from possessing any tracked combat vehicles, engineers were forced to shroud their lethal creations under the innocuous label of agricultural tractors. Before designers settled on the model that would become the Panzer IV, the armaments industry squandered colossal resources on utterly absurd concepts, such as the Großtraktor or the Nuberfahrzeug, veritable monuments to technical inefficiency with their multiple turrets and needlessly sophisticated mechanisms. These monsters, weighing over 20 tons, suffered from chronic overloading and near-zero mobility, rendering them totally unfit for modern manoeuvre warfare, and finally forcing the authorities to abandon these dead ends to initiate a more pragmatic escort vehicle project. The competition for this new support tank, designated internally as the Battalion Commander's Vehicle, highlighted the technical limits of the era when Rheinmetall's design was ousted by the Krupp firm's concept. Although Krupp offered no revolutionary solution, but rather a conservative compromise, they secured the contract. A technical curiosity revealing a rushed design and the cramped nature of the internal space lies in the vehicle's asymmetrical architecture. The turret was offset approximately 8 centimeters to the left, while the engine was shifted 15 centimeters to the right. This physical constraint was necessary to allow the drive shaft to pass from the rear engine block to the gearbox located in the front. Instead of prioritizing a Vanguard torsion bar suspension, the builders obstinately stuck to an archaic leaf spring suspension, consisting of 8 small road wheels per side. While this choice simplified production, it immediately limited the vertical wheel travel and, by extension, the tank's ability to traverse broken terrain. The initial version, Model A, featured hull armour of barely 14.5mm, a protection so derisory it could be pierced by simple heavy machine guns, turning the crew's survival into a pure exercise in probability. The heart of this steel monster, in the first series, was a 12-cylinder Maybach engine developing 250 horsepower, a force that barely managed to propel the vehicle beyond 30 km per hour on the road, a dismal performance for the ambitions of Blitzkrieg. Armament was limited to a short 75mm gun, whose stubby barrel possessed a muzzle velocity so low it resembled a mortar, more than a precision artillery piece, making any confrontation with other armour tragically ineffective. Thus, a machine emerged from the assembly lines marked by congenital flaws, too thin a skin, too weak a heart, and a weapon incapable of striking with authority. Hardly had the first examples rolled out of the factory gates when the pitiless reality of technical failures forced engineers into frantic rectifications, as the original design proved utterly insufficient for genuine combat engagement. To attempt to compensate for the vehicle's humiliating inertia, subsequent versions, the Models B and C, were fitted with a more vigorous engine block, the Maybach HL 120TR, boosting output to 320 horsepower and allowing for a theoretical top speed of 40 km per hour. However, this did nothing to alter the fundamental structural vulnerability of the machine. Simultaneously, the radio operator's hull machine gun was deleted in favour of a simple vision slit and a pistol port, paradoxically reducing its close-quarter defence capabilities, while the frontal armour was uprated to 30mm to offer at least minimal protection against splinters and light projectiles. The invasion of Poland in September 1939, involving 211 of these vehicles, brutally swept away the illusion of invulnerability. Polish 37mm anti-tank guns pierced the steel plates of the German support tanks with terrifying ease. Although propaganda hailed a swift victory, the Wehrmacht mourned the loss of 76 of these supposedly superior machines, 19 of which were struck from the inventories as total write-offs, their thin metal walls unable to offer any serious resistance to enemy shells. In reaction to this slap in the face, production of the Model D was launched in haste, reintegrating the bow machine gun and increasing side armour to 20mm. Yet, the total weight inexorably climbed toward 20 tons, pushing the running gear, originally calibrated for much lighter loads, to its critical limits of mechanical tolerance. The campaign in France in May 1940 brought an even more bitter conclusion when German crews collided with British Matilda tanks and the French B-1 Bears monsters. Against their thick hides, the explosive shells of the short, stubby German cannon shattered without the slightest effect. This encounter with massive Allied armour demoted the Panzer IV to the rank of a helpless spectator, as its primary armament lacked any significant penetration force against modern shielding, forcing crews into flight or desperate manoeuvring. In a burst of technical improvisation, the subsequent version, Model E, was equipped with additional 30mm steel plates simply bolted onto the front. This caused the weight to jump to 21 tons, aggravating the fatigue of the front leaf springs and further sabotaging mobility. Despite tactical successes that owed more to the use of radio than to the quality of the hardware, the Wehrmacht was plunging eastward with a tank that was heavier and slower, while its offensive power remained lamentably stagnant at pre-war levels. The offensive launched against the east in June 1941 marked the definitive collapse of existing German armoured doctrine, as crews of the Panzer IV, which service manuals still euphemistically classified as a heavy vehicle, suffered a traumatic shock of reality. While propaganda trumpeted absolute technical supremacy, soldiers at the front discovered their machines were virtually impotent against the Soviet T-34 and KV models, whose modern sloped armour caused the slow projectiles of the short German cannon to ricochet like harmless pebbles. More humiliating still was the fact that even light Soviet tanks, with their small 45mm pieces, pierced the Panzer IV's armour with chilling ease, leading to the destruction of 348 of these supposed miracle weapons on the Eastern Front during the year 1941 alone. A matching tragedy was unfolding simultaneously in the sands of the North African desert, where the few available Panzer IVs shattered against British Matilda infantry tanks, confirming once again their total inadequacy in a direct duel. Major General von Mellenthin later noted with bitterness that the 75mm gun, shortened to a mere 24 calibers, possessed no penetration force worthy of the name due to a derisory muzzle velocity. Troops were thus forced to employ extremely costly 88mm anti-aircraft guns to halt adversary tanks in the face of their own primary battle tank's failure. In a desperate attempt to increase survival odds, the version F1 was developed, finally bringing the integral frontal armour to 50mm, but this increase in protection imposed a staggering technical tribute. The total weight of the vehicle climbed to 22 tons and 300 kilograms, increasing the ground pressure to such a degree that the narrow 380mm track sank inexorably into the liquid Russian mud, dramatically degrading mobility. To prevent this bogging down, it was necessary to introduce wider 400mm tracks in haste and laboriously redesign the drive sprockets and idler wheels. Yet this did nothing to mask the underlying reality. Engineers were merely piling tons of steel onto a desperately undergunned chassis. The crisis reached its zenith when Adolf Hitler himself intervened in the development, demanding the installation of a 50mm gun, a project that proved utterly absurd, as the imposing chassis of the Panzer IV was vastly oversized for such a small caliber, which would have resulted in the creation of a multi-ton colossus endowed with the puny striking force of a light reconnaissance tank. The technical response to the disaster suffered on the firing lines took the form of a radical and perilous surgical operation upon the vehicle's turret. Engineers, defying all original design principles, crammed the long 75mm cannon into its bowels, the Model 40 with a barrel length of 43 calibers. This variant, which passed into history under the designation Model F2, finally granted the tank the capability to pierce an armoured steel plate 89mm thick at a distance of 1,000 metres. However, this technical triumph dramatically shifted the centre of gravity forward, subjecting the front leaf springs to permanent structural overload. To domesticate the enormous recoil impulse of this new high-pressure piece, the installation of a single-chamber muzzle brake became imperative, which lengthened the armoured vehicle's global silhouette and considerably restricted its manoeuvrability in wooded or urban areas. During the summer of 1942, these modified machines reached the front lines and briefly restored a semblance of technical equilibrium, as they were finally capable of engaging Soviet T-34s and American Grant tanks in North Africa from safety distances. British troops, who christened this variant with prayerful awe as the Panzer IV Special, quickly identified the threat, but the low initial volume of just a few dozen machines prevented any strategic pivot, as German industry proved unable to compensate for losses adequately. Very soon, production transitioned toward the Model G, characterized by a more efficient double-chamber muzzle brake and the deletion of the turret's side vision slits to simplify manufacturing and preserve, as best as possible, the structural integrity of the armour against impacts. This frantic arms race, however, imposed its relentless physical tribute as the total weight inexorably climbed toward 23 tons and 600 kilograms, pushing the chassis, originally calibrated for 17 tons, into the final strongholds of its mechanical resistance. The vehicle's silhouette was so profoundly altered by this long appendage that Soviet reports frequently and erroneously classified this variant as a Tiger Type 4, which testified less to the tank's actual power than to the confusion reigning on the battlefield, where this fundamentally obsolete model was now attributed physical capabilities it could barely support. While the firepower was now theoretically sufficient, the excess weight definitively degraded the agility of the former support tank, transforming it into a weary colossus that swayed dangerously at the slightest irregularity of the terrain. In the summer of 1943, during the vast operation unleashed in the Kursk salient, a glaring statistical paradox came to light. Contrary to popular belief, it was not the new heavy models that bore the brunt of the tank battles, but the Panzer IV, despite being technically exhausted. Within decisive units, such as the 48th Armoured Corps, these vehicles constituted the absolute majority, although their multiple modifications made them almost unrecognisable, leaving their identity to be guessed only by the characteristic silhouette of their running gear. To face the permanent threat of Soviet anti-tank rifles and shaped charges, the flanks and the turret were draped with steel plates 5mm thick, the famous Schürzen, which gave the tank a bloated appearance, while adding 500 kilograms to its already critical mass. Technical evolution reached its most questionable zenith with the series designated as Model H, for which engineers finally reinforced the frontal hull armour with a massive monoblock steel plate 80mm thick, renouncing the makeshift tinkering of bolted-on additional plates. This protective measure, however, propelled the combat weight to the alarming threshold of 26 tons, definitively shattering the physical tolerances of a chassis originally conceived for the 17-ton class. The front leaf springs found themselves subjected to such destructive tension that the tank pitched erratically at the slightest obstacle. Despite the implementation of a new transmission from the Zahnradfabrik Friedrichshafen firm, the SSG-77, dynamic performance plummeted, with cross-country speed dropping by at least 15 km per hour, thus stripping the vehicle of the tactical mobility that had once been its only strength. In addition to this crushing burden of armour, factories began to coat vertical surfaces with a cement-like paste called Zimmerit, intended to prevent the adhesion of magnetic infantry mines, which further complicated the manufacturing process while paradoxically increasing fire risks upon impact. Faced with this technological dead end, serious voices rose within the command demanding the total cessation of production of this obsolete type, in favour of assault guns or tank destroyers, but the absence of ready-to-use alternatives forced industry to intensify the pace. Thus, the absurd situation was reached where, in 1943, the German productive apparatus delivered nearly 3,000 copies of a tank that had exhausted all its development potential and was maintained in combat only by the sheer thickness of its steel and the disproportionate length of its gun. In June 1944, as the Reich's military situation degraded spectacularly, the introduction of the Model J marked a variant that was less a progression and more of a technical regression born of absolute desperation. To accelerate production and economize on strategic raw materials, the builders stripped away the electric auxiliary motor for turret rotation. From then on, the gunner had to laboriously crank the heavy steel colossus by hand. This task bordered on the impossible, particularly when the tank was positioned on a slope and gravity worked against the crew's raw muscular force. The space liberated by the removal of the generator was used to install an additional 200-litre fuel tank to increase a chronically meagre range. But this did nothing to alter the fact that the vehicle's reaction time in the heat of combat was now radically amputated. This dictate of austerity led to further simplifications that undermined the image of quality once associated with Germanic engineering. The massive solid side armour plates were replaced by light wire mesh, the so-called Thoma Schürzen, and the number of track return rollers was reduced from 4 to 3 on each side to save metal and labour time. Even the exhaust system was pruned to its most primitive level, where complex mufflers gave way to simple vertical pipes whose sole function was to suppress visible flames, while the unfiltered roar of the engine ruthlessly betrayed the tank's position. In a fit of technological megalomania, designers even attempted to defy the laws of physics by planning to mount the much heavier turret of the Panzer V Panther onto the gasping chassis of the Panzer IV, or at least to wedge its long 75mm gun with a length of 70 calibers into the existing turret. These experiments failed miserably due to cramped internal geometry and the insufficient load-bearing capacity of the chassis, much like the trial with hydrostatic drive, where 2 oil pumps were intended to set the drive wheels in motion. This technology was indeed innovative, but due to permanent fluid leaks and a chronic lack of spare parts, it proved to be utterly useless. Alongside these exotic attempts existed specialized modifications, such as the submersible tanks originally developed for the thwarted invasion of England. These were theoretically capable of operating at depths of up to 15 meters thanks to costly sealing, but in reality, they were mostly just pressed into emergency service on the Eastern Front. On this same base, bridge-laying tanks and ammunition carriers were built, which only resulted in precious chassis being tied up for auxiliary duties instead of reinforcing decimated frontline units. The final chapter of this technical agony was written in the ruins of 1945, when the last available units were senselessly squandered during the failed offensives in the Ardennes and at Lake Balaton. In the streets of Berlin, broken down or parched tanks were finally simply dug in at intersections and demoted to immobile steel bunkers. Their crews, enclosed in cramped metal cages, awaited the inevitable end, while this once mobile weapon had transformed into a mere static target condemned to annihilation. The silence of the guns in Europe in May 1945 did not, by any means, signify the final demise of this long obsolete construction. In a bizarre twist of history, hundreds of these vehicles found themselves in the arsenals of their former adversaries and neutral states. While the great powers were pivoting their armament programs toward modern concepts, nations like Czechoslovakia, which alone took over 165 examples, or Finland struggled to cobble the remaining wrecks back together. The Finns even kept these rolling anachronisms in active service until 1962, a testament to a complete lack of synchronization with the ballistic and technical developments of the era. The absurd zenith of this post-war chapter, however, unfolded in the Near East, where a significant quantity of models H and J arrived, through circuitous routes from French and Spanish surpluses to find a final, dubious employment within the Syrian army. It is not without a heavy dose of irony that former Wehrmacht officers were recruited as instructors to train Syrian crews on a tank that had been considered technically surpassed 10 years prior, and which was now expected to operate in a climatic environment for which its cooling system had never been calibrated. The utter inadequacy of this machine for modern warfare was exposed without veneer during the so-called War over Water in November 1964. Syrian fours attempted to shell Israeli positions from the Golan Heights, but achieved almost no hits due to their archaic optics and the ballistic insufficiency of their ammunition. The response from Israeli Centurion tanks, armed with modern 105mm guns, was devastating. They liquidated the German relics from distances that lay far beyond the effective range of the old 75mm cannon. The final and perhaps most grotesque scenario occurred during the Six-Day War of 1967, when the last combat-ready Panzer IVs went into battle, side by side with their arch-enemies, the Soviet T-34s, creating a surreal image of total historical confusion. The fate of these last units was sealed the moment they encountered Israeli Super Sherman machines. Thus, the circle of history closed. The Panzer IV, once developed to dominate the world, ended as a charred wreck in the desert sands, destroyed by the very type of American tank it had failed to decisively defeat, even during the Second World War. The technical inferiority of this pre-war design, driven far beyond its physical limits, was thus confirmed in a definitive and crushing manner.